Welcome everyone. I am so honored to be here with our first opening panel, and we're going to talk about LA. So today we're going to hear this is the first time people are really going to hear some of the findings from these two studies that we did at the Williams Institute. I want to start by thanking Supervisors Solis, Mitchell, Hahn, Kuehl, and Horvath, who supported this work and having land help make it possible. And what we're going to do is present some of the data from those two studies, and then we're going to hear from our amazing panel. So let me say right up front that these panelists are really amazing, so please write their names down, look up their work, because we're going to only have a short time to talk today, but each of them has done amazing work and continues to do so. So joining me on the panel, I'll start over here, Kerith, the research director at the Williams Institute, my colleague. Darryn Harris, who is the Chief Government Affairs and Community Relations Officer at St. John's Community Health. Toni Newman, Director of NMAC's Coalition for Justice and Equality Across Movements. And Shelly Page, who is here from the LA LGBT Center, who's a staff attorney on the Homeless Youth Project. So to open this up, we're going to turn it over to Kerith, who's going to talk a bit about the first of our two studies.
Thanks, Elana. Well, I have the wonderful opportunity to tell you about one of our recent studies, the Lived Experiences in LA County project. I'm going to go through a lot of material pretty fast, so I'm going to try to draw your attention to things on the slides that I'd like you to be aware of. Know that we are going to have our reports out in a couple of months, so anything you see today, you can read about in a couple of months, and if you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask them.
I'm not a tech person, so excuse me for I can't get that PowerPoint. Let's do it.
At least we can project it here. Okay, awesome. All right, here's the story. We have enough LGBTQ people to fill a small city in the United States. Right here in LA County, which is a fabulous statistic. Unfortunately, we know very little about them, particularly from representative probability sample studies. But community-based research, including work that we've done here at the Williams Institute, suggests that there's a need to know more. We see that police victimization and homelessness are issues faced by the trans community, particularly trans Latinas in LA. Discrimination in healthcare, particularly for people living with HIV, has been documented, and hunger among LGBTQ people. Enough to say that there's a strong possibility that there are problems for LGBTQ people in LA County, just as we see across the rest of the country. So we had an opportunity. We were contacted by the LA County Department of Public Health, who was doing its annual survey of adults in LA County, drawing a sample of 9,000 people using a address-based sample, which is a terrific way to get a representative sample. And they said, we want to do something with LGBTQ people. And I said, great, do an oversample. They said, yes. They drew a sample of 1,000 LGBTQ people and said, great, we want to call them back and ask them questions specifically about their experiences being LGBTQ people. They said, all right, we'll consent. Folks who agree, you can recontact. So we did, and we got information from 500 LGBTQ adults. We're able to merge the data from the LA Health Department survey with our survey to know quite a bit about LGBTQ people in the county. So we developed a survey using pretty standard procedures. It was a recontact of the folks who agreed to be contacted again for research by mail, email, or text. A 20-minute survey was available in English or Spanish. It could be done online or phone. And people were offered a $20 Visa card or a check for participating. We did the project at the end of December, collected data through January. So I'm going to quickly tell you that the sample is representative of LGBTQ adults in LA County, because the pie slices are about the same size across the different age groups. Your takeaway is that there's a diverse group of people by age in the sample. We're a little bit light on young folks in the sample, but that's probably the only way that the sample is different from the adult population and LGBTQ people in the county. This is what the sample looks like by sexual orientation and gender. The groups in blue are gay and lesbian cisgender people. The groups in yellow are our bisexual cisgender people. And the 15% represents transgender people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. If we look specifically at trans folks, there's diversity in gender identity, looks a lot like what we see now in national samples. Some people are non-binary, some people are binary identified, and we have diversity in sexual orientation with at least half of trans people identifying as bisexual or pan or queer, or along those lines. So in terms of race ethnicity, again, we reflect the county. The majority of people are Latino, Latinx in the sample. And people, many people have been in LA County for 5 years or more, including a good proportion who've lived their entire lives in LA County. All right, economic well-being. We're looking at the unemployment rate right now. So in general, the unemployment rate in LA County for people in the workforce is 5%. So what I want you to see is the size of the bars and the percentages. Are they bigger or smaller than 5%?
Much bigger.
They're much bigger across the board. And one of the differences that's notable, we call it statistically significant, is the 32% with the little red asterisks above is different for low-income people and high-income people, as you would expect, are more likely to be unemployed. Now we're looking at slides for the federal poverty level, and we're looking at people who are low income. And if you're interested in the dollar amounts of what it means to be below 200% of the federal poverty level, there's a little guide up in the right corner of the slide. So a third of people in LA County, 35%, who are LGBTQ are low income, living at below $32,000 for a year for one person household. And because housing costs are so expensive here, we know that that's really not very much money. We see some differences across the LGBTQ community. A notable difference is the difference in the percentage of the population low income between people of color versus white non-Hispanics, 42% versus 20%. What is notable for me is looking back at unemployment. If you look at the BIPOC and white groups, how is the unemployment rate? 15% and 13%. Similar or different?
Similar.
Similar. So people are working at the same levels, but poverty, being at least low income, is very different. This for me, that's something we need to think about. All right, now we're into some LGBTQ specific experiences. We asked about lifetime discrimination experiences in multiple domains of life. And we specifically asked if folks had had an experience of each type in LA County, and this is the percentage who said yes. So a third of the sample, more than a third, had one or more lifetime experiences of discrimination in each of these arenas: at work, in housing, in medical care, getting bank loans in religious settings, and education, or treatment from neighbors or public accommodation. And you can see that the more common forms of discrimination are occurring in employment settings. We asked about lifetime crime victimization. We're reporting it here for lifetime residents of LA County. Many people reporting that they've been mugged, held up, or that they had someone intentionally damage their property. And more than 70% of people who experienced both types of victimization thought that it was very likely they were targeted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, now we're showing you some information about verbal harassment in LA County that folks attributed to their sexual orientation or gender identity. So here, more than 50% of LGBTQ adults are saying that they've experienced verbal harassment in LA County, particularly walking down the street by strangers, going to LGBTQ events like Pride or businesses, sometimes in employment settings, as well as in public accommodations, housing, and medical care. You would think in some instances, if you've been victimized, you might turn to the police for help. Unfortunately, some of the harassment folks are experiencing in LA County is also coming from the police. So 17% of all LGBTQ adults have reported some lifetime harassment by the police in LA County, with differences across groups. More trans people than cis are reporting this experience, more BIPOC than white, and more low income than higher income folks are reporting negative experiences with the police. These slides, I don't expect you to really be able to process except for looking at the height of the groups of bars, okay? So one thing to notice is that a lot of people are avoiding places, public resources, in order to avoid being threatened or physically attacked because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So it's about 15% for the whole population. But the cluster of bars for trans people is much higher than the cluster of bars for cisgender people. And the cluster of bars for people who are low income is much higher than the cluster for people who are low income. So this is something we really need to think about in terms of quality of life. What does it mean when you're limiting your activities in order to stay safe? And how does this differentially affect people in our communities? So as you would expect, living in a place that has both positive characteristics and also these adverse experiences have implications for mental health. So 1 out of 5 people in the sample had symptoms of moderate to severe anxiety in the 2 weeks prior to the survey. And in the year before the survey, many people reported that they'd received mental health care. A quarter of people felt that they should get care, but hadn't. And basically a quarter said they were fine and didn't need anything. When we asked about barriers to care, many were worried about costs. They didn't know where to get treatment. And about a third of the folks who felt they should get care but hadn't, couldn't find a program or professional knowledgeable and supportive of LGBTQ people. Adversity also has implications for outness. We find that people are not out to all people in all domains of life. The groups that are in red reflect people who are not out to anybody in each category, and parts of the bars that are in blue reflect outness. So you can see most people are out to friends and family. Fewer people are out at work. Surprisingly, a quarter of people aren't out to any healthcare providers, and many people are not out to religious and spiritual communities. It's not all gloom and doom. We know we are a resilient community. We prefer to live without adversity. Who knows what we could accomplish? But nevertheless, we find sources of joy in many things. And these are responses from Write-In. I didn't plan it, but I have to say I'm happy that sex ended up right in the middle of the slide. But family, friends, pets, these are common sources of joy that people in our community report. All right, we also asked about parenting and family formation. We found that about 1 in 5 people are parents in LA County. This is similar to what we see in national samples. We asked people if they want children, any kids or more kids, and 42% said yes. We see some differences across the population where more bisexual people and cisgender lesbians are more interested in having kids than cisgender gay men, but still about a third of cisgender gay men are interested in having kids. We see that people of color are very interested in having children, more so than white LGBTQ people, and lower income people more than higher income people. And there's some degree of overlap between some of these demographic characteristics and income. We asked people, what, if anything, should elected officials do to support people in having and raising kids? And many said things like remove insurance barriers to ART, you need to cover just like straight people, and tax credits for surrogacy, and make it easier to adopt and foster kids. But other people shared things that reflected experiences of stigma, and said things like this: make it known to all that they support the LGBT community, that we are not pedophiles, and explain the difference to those who don't know the difference. So many indicated a general wish for support and for elected officials to stand up to LGBTQ people and to push back against the narrative of deviance. We asked people what elected officials should do to improve quality of life for LGBTQ people in the county. And they said things like, stand up for quality support, protect us, listen, address housing costs, and asked our respondents what people contribute to community and culture of LA County. And we heard that LGBTQ people are the culture, that straight people would be lost without our guiding light, and that LA would just be traffic. Again, humor, resilient contributions to the civic life in LA County. A little bit of attitude too, which I think is helping. So many people made all this work possible, funding and getting out of the world. Just want to thank them. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerith. Thank you so much. It's actually kind of going to be hard to follow that, but we do have a whole second PowerPoint, and we think this one will be both on Zoom and in the room. But we're having some challenges making that happen. Happening? Mm-hmm. Can we do another round of applause? We did it. Okay, great. So we're going to start and move quickly through the findings from our second of two studies. So whereas the first study, as Kerith mentioned, was a callback study, this second study was done in partnership with Trans Latina Coalition. And it was done through listening sessions with community members and through a partnership with the community organization to do outreach and make sure that we were asking the right questions and we're asking as many people as possible. And we did aim to get across the county. So we asked questions around demographics, economic well-being, transportation, health, community, access to services, housing, etc. These questions were developed from feedback we got from community members. I have a slide here and I took it out, but I just want to say this. The principal investigators here were Jody Herman, who's here in the room with us, and Mary Sincero. And we also had an amazing team with Williams Institute people, as well as people from Trans Latina Coalition, and Queen Victoria Ortega and Lucas Rojas from Flex, who helped support Trans Latina Coalition. So a lot of people were involved in this and made this possible. It's very important to mention that. So as I mentioned, we did try to reach as far across the county as we could. And we got, as we might expect, the majority of our responses came from the central part of LA, in particular, the zip code surrounding Trans Latina Coalition. So we saw a real density there. But we also had responses from some in the north parts of the county and some in Long Beach. So we get some responses from different places outside of the more foreseeable ones. So we had a pretty broad age range. 41% though were under, were 25 to 34, and 17% were 18 to 24. So relatively young. And as you can also see here on our slides, the Latina representation was very high. So that is an overrepresentation, but it is also consistent with the fact that we are working with Trans Latina Coalition, which has been doing most of their outreach within their community spaces. We also saw about 70% were U.S. citizens by birth and about 30% immigrants in various statuses. And I'm going to skip to gender. We saw that we had about a large representation of trans women or women identified people, and everybody in the study was trans or non-binary identified. So then we also had 22% trans men and 34% identified as non-binary. Now, one really notable thing here is that we had a relatively high representation of intersex people. We had 15% of our respondents said that they had variations in their sex characteristics, which is a more explicit way of asking, more direct way of asking about intersex status. And also, when asked about who identified as intersex, we saw about 10%. So those numbers are actually much higher than we usually see. So it is probably indicative, related to the fact that we're asking within trans communities, but it's also something that I look forward to exploring in our final report. Another really important note here is that 50% of our respondents were living near or below the federal poverty line. So thinking back to Kerith, we saw similar high rates, right? Extremely high for trans people. That's compared to 14% of LA County general population. And similar to the other study, we saw high rates of food insecurity, high rates of using SNAP, WIC, participation in CalWORKs, government programs to support economic security, and also 49% found it difficult to pay for usual household expenses. We also saw that in the last 12 months, 70% of our respondents had taken some action to avoid discrimination in the workplace, and 28% reported unemployment. And you may remember the 5% number from Kerith's slides earlier. That is quite a lot, right? That's almost 6 times, is that right? Math check, thank you. So a very high rate of unemployment, very high rates of economic insecurity. We also, and this is a slide I want to really emphasize because maybe we'll talk about it later, but 38% reported that they had ever engaged in sex work and 23% in the past year, which maybe is, we don't know yet if that's representing, or people are underreporting that because it's a question people may not want to answer, but this is the really striking part. 70% of people who said that they had done sex work in the past year said that they would not continue to do sex work if they could make as much money doing something else. So in the words of one of our respondents, we need access to jobs that pay a livable wage and don't force us into sex work. Every trans person I know either is in sex work or is trying to get into it in order to afford rent and food in Los Angeles. Also, 74%, so 3/4 of our respondents were cost burdened. Of those who rent or own. So very high rates of some of the indicators of housing insecurity. And of course, 26% reported that they had ever been homeless in LA County because they're trans. 28% had tried to access a shelter and were denied because they were trans, or that was how they reported they were denied. And 64% of those who stayed in shelter said that the shelter made them feel safe as a trans woman, 90%. So another thing to emphasize, and I think this is really important in thinking about in LA, is that we did emphasize transportation quite a bit. And this came from our listening sessions, and also we were really curious to know how transportation affected, particularly economic security. So 18% said that there were places they needed to go they couldn't get to because of lack of transportation, and 33% delayed or avoided going places they need to go, including medical appointments, because it would take too long to get there, it's too far to travel. 33% found it not safe to walk or bike where they lived. And 32% said it wasn't safe to use public transportation. So one person said this affects directly their economic security, because they said, when I get offers for gig work that isn't accessible by public transportation, I have to turn it down. People can be taking buses 1.5 to 2 hours just to get to a pap smear. This is for healthcare, right? You know how many trans men I know who just refuse to do it? How many trans people's cancers are going undetected for so many reasons? 14% of our respondents said they were not covered by health insurance, and 21% delayed getting prescriptions. 44% delayed getting gender-affirming care or did not get it. So one person said, when I moved and got new insurance, I had a very difficult time finding LGBTQI+ doctors and therapists, and ended up not going since no one covered my insurance, advertised for queer people, or was in the city. We also looked at immigration status, and of those who had identified themselves as immigrants, as not U.S. citizens by birth, 63% had applied for asylum, and of those who applied, 49% had gotten it. So in other words, 50% didn't get it. And of those, more than half were applying on the grounds of being trans, non-binary, intersex, or LGBT. Also, we asked about immigration detention. This came up in our listening sessions and in talking with our community partners. 50% of people who identified as immigrants had been held in immigration detention. And of them, half of them had a negative experience, including threats, assault, or denial of healthcare. And almost half had no support for clothing, food, or housing after they left detention. So once they got out of the carceral system, they didn't have anywhere to go for support. 52% said they'd be uncomfortable asking the police for help, and 22 had been stopped by the police in the last 12 months. 11% have been held in jail or juvenile detention in LA in the last 5 years. And 22%, about a fifth of our respondents said that that actually their conviction had resulted in barriers after they were incarcerated. So like a criminal record or other experiences downstream from being in jail had affected their ability to access services. In their own words, someone said, "I still feel like I'm not taken seriously by most people in most places, particularly medical staff and law enforcement. Police do not protect us. TJs people have to take care of themselves." And this was another one that's really really extreme. Someone said, "The police patted me down, forced me to show my prosthetic packer, and asked inappropriate questions, forced me to come out." Now, I want to end on this slide because it's sort of a bright light, but also really something for us to think about. That many people expressed that their comfort with accessing services from the government was lower compared to getting those services or seeking support from community organizations. So 50% said they were less comfortable, and 38% said around the same level of comfort. But very few said they prefer to go to the government to get services. So I think that really supports, the sort of many people were saying they would want to get those services from community organizations. And when you look at the data that we got on when people did try to access benefits or services, 40% applied, and more than half of them had problems because they were trans. And 33 went in person to a government office, and about half of them were misgendered, denied access to bathrooms, or mistreated by staff or security. So I'm going to stop there. We're going to turn to our panel to talk a little bit more about what these findings mean. Now I'm switching microphones. Kind of like a wardrobe change, but change. My first question is going to be for Shelly. Shelly, much of your work focuses on homelessness and housing. We saw that in our sample, we did have some young adults, but also that people across the age range are experiencing homelessness or challenges to housing security. So for example, we saw in both studies, there were examples of harassment. In the LELAC study, we had documentation of street harassment from strangers, and also both studies found some precarity around housing. So my question for you is, what are the housing barriers that LGBT people may face that are particular to LA? And what are some strategies for moving people to more stable housing?
So, can you guys hear me?
Closer.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, so that question is twofold, and the first part, the housing barriers that I've seen that LGBTQ plus people are facing in Los Angeles, particularly within the age group that I represent, which is youth 18 to 24 who are at risk for experiencing homelessness. The main issue is affordability. Housing is outrageous and it's unaffordable for most, if not all of my friends. I've also seen a lot of criminal background checks, which the study touched on briefly, but a lot of housing applications require that they do a background check, and if they see that you have a criminal background, a lot of people are being denied. That is also similar for undocumented immigrants. I think that's one issue that comes up, and that is a huge factor in homelessness. And then there is a small subset of discrimination from landlords and other tenants, forcing people to move out, harassment, and things like that. So it sounds bleak, but I think that there are some strategies that we can employ to try to combat some of these barriers. For instance, rent control and other tenant protections, and a wider allocation of public funds would really benefit a lot of low income and no income individuals in Los Angeles, such as like subsidized programs and actually lowering the requirements to receive those subsidies would really help. I also think that removing background checks completely for housing applications would be of a great benefit, especially from the previous findings that we saw where a lot of LGBTQ identifying individuals, particularly trans and non-binary individuals, are participating in sex work and are having run-ins with police. So it's really difficult to try to find housing if you have that on your record. And then also just ticketing and harassment by police. There is something called like quality of life tickets, which is, you know, they're stopped for loitering, for littering, for just being suspicious. And I've seen in my line of work that a lot of the people that are getting stopped for these type of tickets are LGBTQ, and they're just being suspicious or, you know, they're not moving along. And that's a huge factor in finding housing.
Thank you.
Yeah, interested.
No, we're gonna want Chris to come back to some of these items in a minute. I'll turn to my second question. Toni, so you've been part of many movements. You have led or been part of movements in LA and also nationally, addressing racism, addressing HIV and AIDS epidemic, addressing LGBTQ work and trans issues in particular. You've been on the board of Trans Can Work, part of the Transgender Strategy Center. So you really thoroughly have an incredible resume to talk about this next question. So we saw the unemployment issue. We saw the issue of high rates of unemployment as well as economic precarity in both studies. So across the board in our respondents, we saw evidence of both issues with employment as well as issues of other kinds of economic stability. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about specifically the angle of for trans people of unemployment issues and what barriers are causing unemployment, as well as what strategies might remove those barriers. And I can give you a computer here.
I have a I want to acknowledge Dr. Sandy O'Nally, a former board member of Trans Can Work Raising. She and I work very closely, and I'll be giving data from the Trans Can Work. Trans Can Work is a workforce development company. And in December, just to show you how hard it is for trans folks to get work, they lost $600,000 of funding, and we laid off the staff on January 29th. It was due to James Irvine's $600K and the Community College Foundation, California's Foundation of Community Colleges at $400K that came to our rescue to keep us in business. So this lets you know, as the chair of the board for Trans Can Work, you cannot survive anywhere without a job and revenue. Most trans folks, and our data shows that 60% of the trans folk in LA County make under the poverty level. That means they barely have enough money to pay their rent, get food, and do what they need to exist. You know, America is a capitalistic society, and you can't exist here without money. So I'm going to list 5 barriers that we found at Trans Can Work that are holding the transgender non-conforming community back. Discrimination and harassment. Many face discrimination or harassment based on their sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. This creates a hostile work environment impacting their mental health and productivity. Lack of legal protections. At Trans Can Work, we had to teach them, know your rights. They go in these positions and they're treated very poorly. And if you don't know your rights, people will kind of step all over you. So we at Trans Can Work is telling them to know your rights and what are your legal protections. And if the human resource department of your company doesn't, keep climbing that ladder and go all the way to the EEOC. And we've had 42 out of the last 114 people in 2023 had to go above the human resource director of their company and file a complaint with the EEOC with our assistance and the Transgender Law Center. We're finding microaggressions. They are experiencing subtle forms of discrimination. You're a trans woman. Hi, he. Hi, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And they continually do that, which will at some point affect your mental health. You've designated that you would like to be called she, her, and hers, but your supervisor, come on in, John, thank you, he. And that's their way of subtly kind of making you feel inferior. Unequal opportunities. We find that 72% of the trans folk in the workplace were passed over for higher jobs. The manager job comes up, they all apply. It just wasn't the right fit for you this time, but we value you and you stay at the same pay and at the same job year after year. Lack of inclusive policies and practices. Some workplaces lack inclusive policies and practices such as gender-neutral restrooms, inclusive health benefits, LGBTQ employee resource groups, which makes you feel excluded. Go up. So those are what we're finding in the workplace at Trans Can Work. We're finding a lot of employers, once identified as a TGNC person, will find a reason not to hire you or give you the job. We don't have the right bathrooms. We don't have the appropriate facilities for you to go to. It doesn't take much to have a gender neutral bathroom or just allow that person to go into the bathroom that they're gender identified. So what can we do? What can you do as Americans? We can implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion policies, provide diversity training, establish supportive employee resource groups, ensure equal benefits and opportunities, promote allyship. Allyship means not just your word, but your actions. Your actions tell others where your heart really lies. And creating safe reporting mechanisms, keeping it open that trans individuals and TGNC individuals feel safe to maneuver. And just a personal story, I've been a CEO 3 times in California. I mainly work for 4 white men, 1 Asian woman, and a Black woman. And sorry to say, I found most of my discrimination and racism came from my board chairs, who were white men. They misgendered me, they mistreated me, but I stood the ground, and I've been an educator and assistant dean before I became a trans person. So I've worked with people who had, for obviously Black, I was a Black person in a predominantly white university. So that type of, I switched over from being Black to being discriminated because I was trans. So I identified and I maneuvered well because I understood the policies and politics behind it. Most of the transgenders and TNG folk doesn't have that background. And that's how I was able to maneuver and go from one job to another with recommendations and acceptances from previous supervisors. It's difficult when you're mistreated on a job and you need income and you feel unwanted and just not treated fairly. So I think for me, legal policies with over 503 laws targeting TGNC folks in America, the law, you can't dispute it. When they go to court to keep us out, we go to court to get back in. And that's the way to beat them in my mind. And that's why I've studied the law. This is why I'm here today. And I'm glad that Brad and Elana invited me. The law can protect you, or it should protect you. Now, sometimes we go to court and we lose. we don't win, but it should. And most times, We're fighting in Tennessee and Alabama at NMAC for the Coalition for Justice. We have about 15 briefs we're battling across the country to keep transgender rights just fair. And my philosophy is I don't want special treatment. I'm not special. I just want what's fair. And I think that's what 99.9% of trans folk are. It's just what's fair. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Toni. Now I want to turn to Darryn. You come with a wealth of experience both in the executive realm and also the legislative realm, with 8 years as chief of staff for Mayor Bass when she was Representative Bass. And you've worked with UCLA, you've worked with community organizations in Los Angeles. So you have just a lot of experience in this area. So I really want to turn to you and ask you this question. In our studies, we heard a lot of distrust and negative experiences across the board from government, whether that was from accessing services or interacting or what people expected that they could get from government, and of course with law enforcement as well. So this is especially true for trans people and especially true for our respondents of color. Another specific outcome was underutilization of services in healthcare. So my question is, what can and should government agencies be thinking about when it comes to these barriers or these challenges? And what steps would you recommend to address them?
Great. Well, thank you all for just inviting me. I really appreciate it. Quite a privilege to be here at the Williams Institute. When I think about government, I just think about, my experience with government and it's sort of my family. My folks left Louisiana to come to Los Angeles during the Great Migration. A lot of Black folks left to escape the Jim Crow South to get better opportunities here in Los Angeles. And here the government, were the ones who were providing those jobs at the time. For my grandfather, my mother, my father, my aunt, and, help get folks out of the, working class into the middle class. That gave me a great opportunity. Without that, with saying that, I know my family, they're not perfect. And so, government is flawed, but it's made with, people. And government only works with community engagement. And I think that's the point that I want to make. When I think about how I, got involved in, I don't come from a political family, as I mentioned, but my spark was during the '92 civil unrest. And it wasn't so much about the riots or the cause at the time, because I was very young. But what I did see was how my community came together and how they were able to inform, policy that informed, what should happen within their community, to where those vacant lots then became community gardens. Those liquor stores turned into community health clinics, where I have the privilege of serving today, and having access to healthy food. Unfortunately, many of those issues that existed back in '92, are still plaguing our city today, such as housing insecurity, food insecurity, and police brutality. And so that's the role that I think that, that's not the role, but I think that government just does not work unless you have, everyday people, holding people accountable. I think that's one of the things that make the Williams Institute so great, is because when you're dealing with all this misinformation out there, because not only one side is being loud, both sides are being loud. And so data is very important, clean data, which is why I'm so happy about reading your reports. I can take that back to work. But we're reading reports like that to make sure that, we make a point of that, our points are, going to be very clear. I know that being in Los Angeles, I had a personal story. A few New Years ago, it was New Year's Eve. I wasn't supposed to go out because we were still shut down. But my local bar was open and I went. And so, I drove there and I had a few drinks. And so instead of driving my car back, I Ubered back home. And I said, I'll just get the car the next day. When I came back the next day, the car was gone. And so I was like, oh, wow, well, call my insurance company. At the time I was the chief of staff to Karen Bass. So I had to get back to DC to get back to work because the break was over. And I said, let's just let the insurance companies deal with it. About a week later, I get a call from a woman. I have to make up a fake name now because I didn't get permission to Jackie, from Jackie. And Jackie said, hey, I have your car. And I said, okay, well, like, who is this? This must be a prank, joke or whatever. And then Jackie says, no, is this Darryn Harris? And I was like, well, yeah, it is. You know, is this the police? And she's just like, no, I have your car. And so Jackie tells me, she said, you don't know me, but I remember you. She said, a few years ago, you were at a press conference, and this was, you know, dealing with sex workers. And at the time, and during that press conference, you were the person that said, you know, sex work is work, it should be honored. And so she said, that's the person that I ever felt seen. And so she said, so I don't know what's going on with me and my kids over here, but you need to come back and get your car. You got the wrong one. Okay. And so when I think about Jackie's story, Jackie is a person who is unhoused, you know, who didn't have transportation, you know, who has work, but a person where the system has, you know, failed her. And so I tell Jackie, I said, hey, Jackie, I'm flying back in town on, you know, Friday, you know, let's meet up and get my car. Well, I don't know who Jackie is, so I call LAPD. Hey, I need a police escort. But the police said, well, if we take you down there, we are locking someone up. And I'm just like, why? Like, you know, I just want to make sure that I'm safe. And so, of course, the car was recovered later on. And so I said, you know, officer, I had the most bizarre story. And I go ahead and tell the story. Someone told me that they found my car and all this other stuff like that. And then it was like, well, yeah, we did find the car, but and explain the story, the officer kept correcting me and miscorrecting me, you know, with Jackie and providing the wrong gender. He, him. And as I began to try to correct the officer, I saw he wasn't going anywhere. Anyway, car is recovered. I still drive the same car today. But I did talk to Jackie, say, hey, Jackie, what happened? And when Jackie talked about her engagement with law enforcement and trying to return a stolen vehicle to the owner, you know, again, I just said the system had just, you know, has just failed us. And so what policy should, you know, come about this? I believe that the best public policy, whatever it is, you know, comes from folks who are affected by that public policy. Because when those folks are not at the table, you make mistakes, you know, and so folks can tell you, you know, about their problems, and people could tell you how to solve their problems with the appropriate resources. And so what government is supposed to do is provide the resources, you know, to people's problems. And so, and getting engaged, folks will tell you about housing insecurity. You know, is it rent control? Is it basic, you know, income? You know, is it, I remember talking to the mayor, you know, when I first got my first apartment, I was so excited because I just knew, I didn't know if I was going to get it. This is like right out of college. She was a mayor then. And so she would say, well, you know, when I got my first apartment, I just went in there, pretty much give the person money, get my little deposit. It was a little paper application running about my way. She did not know, you know, it was so many barriers at the time. You know, at the time it was 2.5 times the rent to get an apartment. It was a background check. They had to do all these other, you know, checks and balances. And I do believe in, you know, keeping things safe. But, you know, if you talk to the folks who are affected by the problem, they will offer you the solution. So what is government's role is to listen, you know, listen to the data. The data is clean. It will tell you, you know, it would identify the problem. But in identify the problem, ensure that we are including the folks who are, you know, who are plagued by the issue, you know, at the table, a part of the decision making. You know, at St. John's, we have a trans health program, and it's doing very well. Well, it's doing very well because government is, again, failing. We have to do this, we have to collect data through the UDS. I had to look it up again. Unified Data System. And it's a requirement from HRSA to where we collect our data in order for us to continue to get funded at St. John's. We're a federally qualified health center. And so one of the questions that they want us to ask is, well, what is your sex at birth? And we're saying, well, why does it matter? Why? And because we know that is an extra barrier, you know, and folks coming to get the type of support and treatment that they need. And so it's about ensuring that folks, you know, are at the table when these decisions are being made and that government really works for people. And so I'll just stop right there before I start rambling going on. That answered your question.
Yes,
but
definitely.
Looking forward to getting back.
Let's thank you so much for sharing that story was so illustrative, so point for kind of looking at how it's all connected, right? Also, can we do one more round of applause for all the panelists? I have one more question I want to ask everybody, and then we'll take a question or two from the audience. But my question, just to kind of wrap us here, is looking at the current opportunities that are out there, right? In this moment in time, as Toni mentioned, we have over 500 anti-LGBT laws that are introduced at the state level across the country. We have both pro and con laws, but in California, some of the most protective laws, in Los Angeles, some of the very strong protective laws. So right now, what are the opportunities to really like address the issues we've talked about today, the findings from our studies and some of the other issues that the panelists have raised? What are the policy opportunities right now in this moment? Anyone want to start?
I'll go first. The Coalition for Justice is doing a 2024 Get Out to Vote campaign. We've stepped out from the LGBTQ to get our Sharpton National Action Network, NAACP, Lawyers for Immigrants, about 40 different organizations that we partner with. What I think we can do in 2024 is get out to vote. Your vote matters. And I can't tell you who to vote for, because I vote for a 501c3, not a C4. That would be against the law. But I do say to get out and vote. You want to make a difference? Get some new lawmakers. Get people who want to get things done, instead of throw up and attack a community of 1.2 million people out of 344 million people in America. You got 500 laws attacking 1.2 million people. Only 618,000 of them are getting surgeries. So it's under 1 million people. Why do you care? What have they done to you? And you ask them on Capitol Hill, do you know a trans person? Have you ever ate dinner, had a meal with a trans person? They say no. So you are basing all of your judgments and getting all your laws. My friend told me that a lot of them were pedophiles. I said, that's called gossip. And there's no data. I'm kind of a nerd. Data drives the narrative. So if you want to help, I believe in 2024, something you can do at no cost to you is vote.
Thank you so much. Move it to the next.
I mean, I would agree with that because, you know, within the United States, we know that change, you know, is through two different systems, use the legislative branch and through the courts. And so since I work for a C3 now, I'll put on that C3 hat. But, and knowing that, we know that nothing is ever static. I mean, I never thought in my lifetime that I would be debating the legitimacy of Roe v. Wade. You know, I just thought that it was just given growing up. And so as folks are, you know, trying to take us, you know, back, I think that as the country is changing and it's becoming more diverse and more progressive thinking, I'll say that. I think that the other side, you know, their strategy is to stack the courts. And so I think that's why it's really essential, to your point, that, you know, folks really turn out and vote. Because if not, I think that we're going to have a lot of great progress, you know, can potentially be done for generations. And so, I mean, that's the piece that I will look at. It's like, you know, activate your voice, you know, talk to your friends and your cousins and, you know, other states. My mentor, he passed, Willis Edwards. He always, you know, told me he was the first openly gay man on the NAACP's board of directors. And he always reminded me, because I always thought I had to just wait with these big ideas when I was, you know, starting. And he said, you know what, Darryn, do what you can with what you have, from where you are with what you have. And so, I mean, that's just my, you know, crunch, or my ask to you all is that, you know, you don't have to wait for anything big, but we can exercise, you know, our vote, you know, especially in this upcoming election.
I mean, yeah, I think there's not much for me to add outside of that, but definitely voting and just doing some research on some of the bills being proposed to the legislature right now, and making sure that you're aware. I think knowledge is power, so making sure that you are attuned to what's going on, and not being complacent. Yeah, and just getting back to community-based organizations that are really on the ground, helping a lot of the individuals that we're talking about today.
I'd like to see measurable objectives established for the city around housing, and I'd like to see monitoring and public reporting out on these objectives.
Thank you. Great, so audience questions. Yes.
Maybe less of a question, but more of a general comment about all of these particular ideas. We have a lot of work that goes into appellate work. We have a lot of work that goes into policy. What I see on the ground, working with Trans Can Work, Children of the Night, DCFS, is we have a lot of poor people with individual needs who are being actively discriminated against, and they have no idea where to go. One of the problems I have is a particular client who is a Mexican national, immigrated illegally, yes, very young, very, very talented, very, very bright. She left Mexico because she's transgender and she has death and torture threats against her. But I can't get her into a UCLA or even a USC legal clinic to talk to people about fundamental legal issues because they're so overwhelmed. From the mayor's office, we have LASA, which should be able to help with some housing issues. But I'm wondering, within agencies and within courts and within the city government, can we do something about providing more transgender and LGBTQ representation, and in particular with the court's advocacy toward diversion, deferred sentencing, some degree of civil rights enforcement, some civil services to get people out of programs and out of bad work environments into training programs and into benefit programs that would help them move away from a background that has been difficult. And to Shelly's particular studies, my question would be, could you also focus on whether the legal involvement is infractions, misdemeanors, felonies, and what the effects of those records are? Because when you do a criminal background check, we get the whole ball of wax, and maybe we should restrict civilian checks to felony reports. Just some idea.
Yeah, and that definitely crossed my mind too when I'm responding to that, because there are obviously different, well, the background check, as you said, is very broad, and there's no history that comes with it. It's just kind of just outlays everything. There is a bill that is trying to be passed of it, as I mentioned, prevent or remove, background checks from housing applications. But then it doesn't touch upon the issue that you kind of raised, which is undocumented immigrants, and their fears about applying for housing, fears of being deported, or if they were in removal proceedings, just violating any sort of anything that might get them to have asylum or DACA, however they're trying to legalize their status. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I wish there was an easy answer, but I think there's a lot of different avenues that need to address this issue. And as I said, community-based organizations are there, but they are overwhelmed.
But apart from community-based organizations, and this goes specifically to government authorities, if you get a call from the mayor's office, if you have an advocacy organization or an oversight organization that is within the city, the county, the state government, that calls a landlord that calls a court, that calls an individual organization that is discriminating against individuals, it's going to have a lot more authority than somebody who can give advice to an individual, but maybe it does not technically have the authority of the government behind them, much less the ability to actually intervene if you refuse to cooperate.
Any other response to that before we move on?
Just mentioning that the LA LGBT Center has an immigration law clinic, and Beth said it might also be of assistance to that person. And more broadly, Trans Latina Coalition, I think, is trying to build and extend its supported care offerings along with like wraparound services, which I think are really needed for people who have experienced trauma or coming out of detention, really need support for a prolonged period. So thanks for raising these issues.
Are there any other questions over here? Yes.
My question is for Shelly, is it?
Yes.
You talked about, I mean, I think the common theme I'm hearing is trans people are overpoliced. You talked about these quality of life tickets. Can you speak more to that? I've never heard of that. Is that like a local ordinance? Is that state law? Are they being punished as misdemeanors? Is it a fine? What's going on there with quality of life tickets? Yeah, that's just kind of like a general name that is given to specific misdemeanors and infractions involving things like loitering, littering, you know, standing on the side, just being out and living your life. I guess another example would be like people that are sleeping in their cars, ticketing cars for being in the, you know, violating the street cleaning. Those collection of tickets we call quality of life tickets because for homeless people living in your car, that's where you live. So getting ticketed just for being like in a place that is where you park is affecting your quality of life. There are some resources available in terms of you know, getting these kind of tickets reduced or waived if you're able to complete community service. But I mean, again, that's also an issue of can you get to the court and are you able to speak to the judge and ask for community service, knowing that that's something that you can ask for instead of paying, you know, this like $500 ticket. So yeah, quality of life is just kind of like a nickname, I guess, that we give these collection of tickets.
We need to wrap up. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. So first I want to say, as I mentioned, we don't have nearly enough time to really hear from our panelists. So please check out their other work, show up when they speak next time. And I also want to close with one more quote from our study. This one that I really liked, and it really speaks to what everyone has talked about tonight in terms of, I know as Darryn said, I kind of wrote it down here, something about, can't remember handwriting, but really to start where you're at, right? Do what you can, where you, how is it?
Do what you can from where, well, what you have from now. I can't say.
Do what you can.
Y'all got it. Y'all got it. Y'all got it.
Okay, so I want this last quote is from somebody talking about the power of a community organization that they connected with immediately. It said, I'm Colombian, I'm an immigrant, I was cast out from my country because I'm a trans woman. If it wasn't for the organization that I sought help with, I would probably be homeless. I didn't have other options. So keeping in mind just how important these organizations are, both in terms of meeting community where they're at and also in terms of making sure that people can access the support from our government that's really working to support elderly people. Thank you. You've been awesome help coming up for the 2 minutes.